If this goes unchecked and if we allow it, then we might slowly be eroding the exercise of that freedom. There certainly is, let's say, the risk that these sanctions could have a chilling effect.
Is the EU becoming a new form of despotism?
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom.
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. I present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide. Deprived of all their rights are those citizens living in the European Union, as well as citizens of other countries who fall under the European Council sanctions regime. They can't travel, their bank accounts are frozen, and their property is confiscated. All of this happens outside the law, in violation of the Constitution and of other democratic charters within the European Union. Professor Alexandra Hofer is an expert in international and sanctions law at Utrecht University. She's of Dutch and Canadian background and a specialist in sanctions like those imposed on Jacques Baud, Nathalie Yamb, or Hüseyin Doğru.
Hello, Alexandra. Thank you for having you here.
Hello, Patrick. It's my pleasure.
Are we producing a new kind of outlaws in the EU?
A new kind of outlaw in the EU? That's a big question. I don't know. So I guess you mean the fact that certain people are being sanctioned for expressing their views or for sharing certain opinions that maybe the Council of the EU doesn't approve of. I don't know if that means it would be a new kind of outlaw, but it certainly is interesting that they're putting pressure on people for, sharing information and opinions.
How would you define that?
I would consider it, I do consider it an abuse of the Council's sanctioning power. Whether or not they might, of course, be considered outlaws in the eyes of the Council of the EU. But I don't know if the general population, European citizens would agree that they are really outlaws. So, I guess it kind of depends on what your perspective is, if you would agree that this person would be an outlaw.
The European Council can do what it wants.
It has a very, the language we use, if we look at the Court of Justice of the EU, is it has a very broad discretion when it comes to adopting restrictive measures. And although, of course, this discretion is not unlimited, it definitely has a lot of things that it's allowed to do or able to do. Yeah.
How would you characterize, as an expert, the legal character of these sanctions? Are these sanctions legal, extra-legal, or illegal?
So I think the first time someone mentioned extra-legal was when I was speaking to Pascal Lotas. He asked me if I thought that sanctions were extra-legal. And then I had to take a moment to think, what does extra-legal mean? So I guess it means it falls outside of, let's say, the normal legal procedures, or it's not really governed by law. I'm not really sure exactly what extra-legal means, but I think the interesting thing with sanctions is that they are provided by law. So the Council does have this power. The treaties of the European Union allow the Council to adopt restrictive measures. So in that sense, they are legal in the eyes of the EU, also from the member states that implement them, because there's a legal basis for them. But that doesn't mean that these sanctions can have consequences that would violate, for example, rights enjoyed by the individuals that are sanctioned, or that are owed to, for example, Russia. If Russia is the target of EU sectoral sanctions, some of them might violate agreements between Russia and the European Union. And then they would be illegal sanctions. So it always depends on the circumstances in place, but I guess it certainly is true that sanctions are not, they're not at all the normal. Normally they should not be the norm, or
As a political scientist, I would say the most important thing in legal questions is the Constitution.
Okay.
But It's my point of view.
Yeah, yeah.
But in this case,
Yeah.
the sanctions against persons
Yeah.
is completely against the Constitution, because they have no right, no democratic rights, no human rights, and they have not the right of expression anymore.
Yeah. So again, so that's the thing is with sanctions is they're kind of seen, I guess, as exceptional measures. So the idea is that through sanctions, the EU, for example, is enabled to pursue important objectives such as, that significant aims such as, responding to aggression, responding to human rights violations. So there's some important goal that the sanctions are supposed to achieve. And they are supposed to work in, let's say, a preventive manner. That's the idea, that they're preventive tools. That it's supposed to be a suspension or a restriction on the exercise of human rights, but that restriction is justified in light of the goal that is being pursued. And because I guess EU law stands above the Constitution, for example, in Germany or in Belgium, I guess from a national perspective, well, EU law in this case prevails. And that's provided for normally in these countries' legislation. So then the sanctions are allowed, right? Of course, and like I said, it's the idea of, we see how sanctions impact people. Well, their human rights are affected, but human rights are not absolute, and that these restrictions can be justified. And yeah, they frequently are justified when individuals try to appeal their case before the European Court of Justice. Oftentimes it's found, well, yes, this is a justified restriction in these circumstances.
But what the European Council is doing related to sanctions is completely arbitrary, or?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's trying to be some sort of check or some review process that's provided by the Court of Justice. So, for example, ensuring that the Council has provided sufficient evidence to justify why an individual should be listed, or, has stated the reasons that have to be sufficiently specific, shouldn't be too general. So there's this idea that there is a review, that there's a certain counterweight against the Council of the EU's authority to adopt these restrictive measures. And I don't think that there's enough push against how far the Council can go. And I think it's definitely interesting when the Council decided that they're going to sanction individuals who, in their view, are involved with foreign actors who are sharing or spreading information within the EU that apparently undermines, the EU's democratic societies or its fight to defend, its fight to defend Ukraine, against Russian aggression.
But this means, the effect is, this is a political process and not a legal process.
Yeah, so the decision, I would say, to adopt sanctions is political. Yeah. So sanctions are policy tools. Normally they're foreign policy tools. But there's no judicial process before the sanction is adopted. It's not discussed with legislators, so it's the Council that has this executive power to adopt these measures.
In the case of Jacques Baud, the European Council filed a paper which is completely wrong. This is full of fake news and things who are complete lies. What does that mean? They can do what they want, or what?
So I guess you're referring to the paragraph, the statement of reasons. I don't know if in the meantime Jacques Baud maybe received more information from the Council, which he probably is not allowed to share with the public. But they accused him, or have said that the reason he's being listed is because he acts as a Russian mouthpiece. I think they accused him of spreading Russian propaganda and conspiracies. I'm not quite sure, but I know I've seen talks with Jacques Baud where he says it's completely untrue. I only access sources that are found in the EU or in Ukraine. So the Council has, characterize Monsieur Baud in a certain manner. And so if he decides to challenge these sanctions before the European Court of Justice, he'll probably argue that the Council made an error of assessment. And then the Council will probably try to provide evidence or documents to say, no, our assessment is correct. And then the court will review what Monsieur Baud submits, will review what the Council submits. So they're going to, let's say, the court will provide a review of the Council's statement of reasons and then say whether or not these are sufficiently justified.
Are these sanctions a way of targeting individuals, some individuals, to produce fear under all other individuals to keep their mouths shut?
Well, there certainly is, let's say, the risk that these sanctions could have a chilling effect. And I think that was one of the critiques that was already raised because, of course, these sanctions are based on a directive of the EU and where the Council gives its listing criteria. But the problem with the listing criteria is it's too vague. It's not really clear what the Council would consider to be speech act or activities that should be sanctioned or that would constitute foreign information manipulation or interference. And so because of this vagueness, people might think, I run the risk of being sanctioned if I make certain statements, if I publish certain works, if I express certain opinions, so they might start to self-censor. So there is that risk, of course, when the law is not precise enough. Now, whether or not that is the intention of the Council to create this chilling effect or to cause people to self-censor, I have no idea. But yeah, that's definitely one of the concerns with these sanctions.
Looks like they want to produce a gray zone to make individuals feeling unsafe.
Yeah.
What would you say?
What would I say? Yeah, what do you mean by gray zone? That they want to, so they want to create this hesitancy, this vagueness. Yeah, it's possible that that's what they want to do. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, if you push these types of measures too far, people will push back. Or, you draw attention, let's say, to your own practice, and you might cause people to be more critical or more questioning of your activities, why you're adopting them, why you're pursuing them. So there's the risk, of course, the Council has this broad discretion, but if it doesn't use it wisely, that it might backfire. Because I think the interesting thing, of course, is the Jacques Baud case drew a lot of attention to sanctions, but which have existed for, let's say, at this stage, decades. But they were always targeted against terrorists or people that we call terrorists or armed groups that are operating in a civil conflict, right? So I guess we didn't really question the adoption of these sanctions. But now that people like Jacques Baud were being targeted, it's drawing attention to the sanctioning practice of the Council.
Because people feel this is a way of political prosecution.
Yeah. I mean, the way it's put in place, the justifications it's given, it does look that way. Yeah.
Sanctions have a long history.
Yeah.
And they didn't always target individuals.
Yeah.
You can target states, companies, and all other things.
Yeah.
I remember the sanctions against the apartheid state of South Africa in the year 1977, for example, by a resolution of the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
And this was completely legal. But the sanctions today are not passed by or given out by the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
Is this legal?
So, we call in international law, we call the sanctions that are adopted by the European Union, we refer to them as unilateral sanctions because the EU adopts them exclusively against non-EU member states or, against I can't really say against non-EU individuals because we have proof of the contrary, right? But the idea is normally that these are a foreign policy tool, right? So they're used against non-EU members, whereas Security Council sanctions are also multilateral because they're directed against South Africa, for example, which was or is still a member of the United Nations. So countries have differing opinions on whether or not unilateral sanctions are permissible. Of course, the EU member states say these sanctions are allowed. The US, of course, says they're allowed, Canada, Australia. But countries that are, let's say, well, not only those that are on the receiving end, but a quite significant number of countries often criticize the adoption of unilateral sanctions. Yeah, so they view them as a violation of international law.
These sanctions have a long history, and 9/11 was a crucial point in the history of sanctions.
Yeah, so that is also when the UN Security Council started to target individuals for, that they believed might commit terrorist acts. So the idea was that these sanctions would be preventive tools against terrorism. And all of a sudden, the UN Security Council had a very broad sanctioning power and how it was able to impose restrictions on individuals. So the ones that we see now, asset freezes, imposing an asset freeze or imposing a travel ban.
So these sanctions were a part of the war on terror.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. They started as one of the tools used by the Council in its war against terrorism. And I think it was probably considered to be the Security Council's most important anti-terrorism tool.
And later on, these sanctions were used to bring the Russian Federation under pressure. I remember the Magnitsky Act.
Yeah. So that was adopted by the United States of America. They adopted what you called, the Magnitsky Act. And it was essentially, if my memory serves me right, the purpose was to sanction Russian individuals that were believed to be responsible for the death of Magnitsky, but also those who are involved in corruption in Russia, in human rights violations in Russia. So the US adopted the Magnitsky Act. Canada then adopted a similar act, and eventually the EU adopted its Global Human Rights Act. So I think it was a bit inspired by the Magnitsky Act in the US, but it has, it's not just targeted against Russia, the Global Human Rights Act. It's essentially a tool that the EU has given itself in order to sanction human rights violators worldwide. Interestingly, the EU's Human Rights Act doesn't include corruption.
So firstly, we have the international level, the level of the United Nations, passing sanctions against South Africa,
for example,
because for the apartheid regime. And later on, we see a process of unilateral sanctions of the states, of single states.
I think the U.S. already was adopting its own unilateral sanctions during that time, but it definitely became much more popular with the European Union.
How did the European Union start with sanctions?
So I believe, though I'm trying to have to go back, but so I believe that the European Union at first, they would implement UN Security Council sanctions, and then gradually it amended its own treaties so that it's allowed to adopt its own unilateral sanctions.
Can you characterize the process of sanctioning people or companies? What really happens in this process? Because in the case of Jacques Baud, he didn't get an information at all.
No. So I think, the Council's decision-making process is secretive, right? So that's considered to be something like the Council is not going to be very transparent of who it considers it wants to be listed. Because the whole idea of sanctions is that it will have a surprise effect. If you know that you're about to be sanctioned, you might move your assets so that they're outside of the EU's jurisdiction. So it's intentionally secretive, and it's considered justified by the European Court of Justice. So many people will sometimes appeal their case and say, well, I wasn't given the right to be heard. I wasn't allowed to, defend myself, and they suddenly decided to sanction me. And the court says, yes, well, given the nature of sanctions, this is permissible.
But you have to get the right to be heard.
Yeah.
Everything else is illegal.
Well, and then the court will say, yes, you now have the right to be heard. So again, it's because of the special nature of sanctions and the goal that the EU is trying to pursue. It's accepted that there's certain restrictions on human rights. So, and then so let's imagine you're put on the council's list. You'll find out somehow. I don't believe that the council sends you a letter saying, by the way, you have been sanctioned. I think suddenly you might realize you don't have access to your bank accounts. Or I think in the case of Jacques Baud, he read it in the Swiss press. Nathalie Yamb received a text message from her lawyer, and that's how she found out that she was sanctioned. And then you can go on the website, or you can look at the European Journal, where they announce or publicize the sanctions. And then that's where you can see the statement of reasons. So why did the council decide that you should be sanctioned? If you can then appeal to the council, you can say, can you give me more information on why I've been added to this list? You can try to give them additional evidence to justify that they should reconsider your listing. So the process isn't transparent.
It's completely intransparent. Is there anybody, any authority who's up to evaluate these sanctions?
So I don't know who evaluates it within the Council of the EU. The only review process that I'm familiar with is the European Court of Justice. So that's when individuals essentially decide to request their delisting. So I think at first they appeal to the Council. If that doesn't work, they'll go to the European Court. But not everybody decides to do this.
Looks like a new feudalism, a new feudal regime.
Yeah, so these are measures that have been existing for quite a long time. I think it's even worse if you're sanctioned by the UN Security Council, because now they have the ombudsperson. But before you didn't even have that. You were just sanctioned by the council, and that was it. I guess now because in the EU we have this court system, we think, okay, it's better than the other systems that exist. In the United States of America, it's notoriously difficult to challenge, the sanctions that have been placed against you. So yeah, we rely on the court, and we consider that the court has a good review process.
So this produces, in toto, a lot of legal questions. Can you give us a summary of these legal questions you are asking?
So the questions I have about the court's procedure, or, so what I find that the European Court of Justice is too willing to accept that the fact that the council has so much discretion when deciding who to target. Usually the individuals listed, as I said, they'll challenge the fact that their human rights have been restricted. So the most common challenge you'll hear is, my right to property. I'm not able to access my funds. So that right is being violated. And the court will often say, yes, there's been an interference with the exercise of that right. And so they apply a test. They say, is the European Union or the Council of the EU pursuing a legitimate aim? Usually it's found that they are, because, for example, in the case of Russia, the idea is, we want to fight against Russian aggression. We want to assist Ukraine in defending itself. Okay. The measure has to be provided by law. Very often that is the case, because a sanction has been, adopted according to the legal procedure allowed within the EU treaties. And then the other question is, is this interference with the human rights justified? Is it proportionate? Is it not too excessive in light of the goal pursued by the council? And that's usually where I have the most criticism, is how they do this, let's say, proportionality test, or this balancing act between the goal pursued by the council and the effect that the sanction has on the individual. Usually it's just, in light of the objective pursued, this small infringement or this inconvenience, they don't use those words, of course, right? But you kind of get the sense that the court doesn't really weigh the impact that the sanctions can have on a person's life.
do you know any list of criteria, for example, for defining who is a Russian mouthpiece or a terrorist actor?
Russian mouthpiece is the word that was used against Jacques Baud. I'd be curious to see if he, appeals his case before the Court of Justice, how they will interpret what a Russian mouthpiece means, right? Because that's a very general, unclear term. A terrorist actor. So I'm not really sure what definition of terrorism they use when they adopt the sanctions list, but I suspect that it might have focusing on the activities that the person might carry out. Interestingly, in the case of the sanctions, we saw it against Syria as well, against Myanmar, against Russia. Sometimes people are sanctioned because they are the family member of, someone that is considered to benefit from the wrongful act that the EU is responding to, for example. So, and the court has annulled listings when it had to do with the person being associated with. So they kind of tried to define criteria to say, okay, when is somebody sufficiently associated or not? They have to share interests or they have to have certain activities in common. But I think at least I find it a bit difficult to identify common criteria or common checklist that you could say, okay, this is always the test that is applied. I think it varies on a case-to-case basis.
On the Federal Press Conference in Berlin, said a spokesperson of the Foreign Office of Germany, everybody who's underway with these topics like Jacques Baud can get under sanctions. That's a great threat against all dissidents of the state and the government's narrative. This is completely arbitrariness, or what would you say?
Yeah. Well, I don't even know if it's a threat against dissidents, because I think it's even if you just have a different opinion or, you're critical or you have a different perspective, you can have that without necessarily being a dissident. And I think that's the whole point. If we're talking about democracy and we want to live in a democracy, we want to defend democracy, well, you have to accept the fact that people will have a different opinion. And they're going to express that. They're going to talk about it. They're going to share it. So, that's just life in a democratic society. So it's interesting that certain people in positions, I don't know exactly how high-ranking that person would be, but, you work within a state. You represent that state. Again, it's supposed to be a democratic state, but that an individual in that position thinks it's okay to say, well, if you have certain views, you can, fear being sanctioned. I don't know how they reconcile, let's say, those two ideas.
Would you say that this spokesperson said is a threat?
Perhaps, but I don't know in what position they are to actually give that threat.
It is a speaker of foreign ministry.
So if that's the position of the foreign ministry, it's possible that they're giving that warning, maybe,
Yes, and there was no revocation of that by the minister.
So they defended that. They were okay with that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, so within the Council of the EU, it's all of the member states have to agree. Right. So, there might be that position defended in Germany. And then I guess all other member states agree with that perspective. So I know, for example, Spain lately, at least the president has been more critical towards Israel than other members of the EU, or, less willing to align itself with the United States and the war that they're carrying out in Iran. So again, how do you decide, given this diversity that exists within the EU, some speeches which are more prominent in certain member states than in others, how do you decide which perspectives or views points shouldn't be shared? How do you agree with that, as, if all 27 members are supposed to have a seat at the table and be part of the discussion, how do they reach that assessment?
So the game is the member states are kicking the ball to Brussels.
Yeah.
Brussels is deciding who's on the sanction list.
Yeah.
And then they're kicking the ball to the member states, and the member states say, it comes from Brussels, we can do nothing.
Yeah.
So is this a blame game?
I think, well, again, it's not Brussels, it's not people that are separated from the member states that decide who is sanctioned. It's the member states agree who should be on the list. So we see that there can be this, let's say, tug of war with Hungary that doesn't always agree that certain sectors of Russia should be sanctioned, or now Hungary is, let's say, vetoing the loan that would be granted to Ukraine now. Right. So there are member states that sometimes say, no, we don't want these types of sanctions to be in place because it'll affect us too much. So then they have to negotiate and they have to come to an agreement. And sometimes there are exemptions that are put in place for, countries like Hungary or countries like Greece or Cyprus who don't want their shipping industry to be affected. So it's like, okay, afterwards, once the legislation has been adopted, indeed, it's an EU directive, you have to, and then a regulation, you have to implement it. But there's something that happened before we reached that point. And that's up to them to be part of the process, to be aware of what's going on. And these sanctions are reviewed every 6 months. So they also have the opportunity to say, actually, maybe we should reconsider something.
But they don't, mostly.
But apparently they don't. So, yeah.
Are these sanctions, especially sanctions against individuals, a tool, a weapon in information warfare of NATO?
I don't know. So I don't know what the involvement of NATO. I know that over the years, we're increasingly seeing, this weaponization of information or concern about misinformation, disinformation.
Who's defining that?
That I don't know. That certain opinions or thoughts or things like that we should be concerned about them. And so then that would justify censorship or, policies or activities that look like censorship. Yeah. So, and then we seem to be willing to accept that because we think that restricting access to this information or sharing it will protect us. I don't know to what extent NATO would be involved.
Do you have the feeling that everything who's scratching at the wall of the power elites will be defined as disinformation?
It's possible. I don't know. So of course, it's interesting. It's a certain, what we call elites. They have a certain worldview. They have certain agendas. They have certain policies which they believe are justified. And if they start sanctioning people or adopting policies to restrict people from, going against that or speaking out against that, then it looks like they are using the law or, tools such as sanctions in order to safeguard their own interests. But, I have no idea.
Which way do you see for the targeted individuals to challenge those measures?
Yeah, well, the best opportunity, they could, for example, like Jacques Baud. So he is a Belgian resident. He could go before a Belgian court and challenge Belgium's implementation of the sanctions. In that case, the Belgian court will immediately see this, okay, this is the competence of the EU, so they will automatically refer it to the General Court of the European Union. Or he just goes directly to the Court of Justice of the EU to challenge the sanctions.
But this can take years.
It can take years, yeah.
So, and he will be for years under sanctions.
Unless the council suddenly decides, okay, we've reviewed and we've decided to remove you from the list.
And again, we are in the middle of arbitrariness.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's, again, it's one of the concerns. I know that, so I think the case of Jacques Baud and others that are on that sanctions list, I would say that it really is an issue of freedom of expression and the freedom of information. And there is a case RT France versus Council. So RT France was, Russian state-owned media outlets were immediately sanctioned when the war broke out in February 2022. And RT France versus Council challenged their listing, saying, well, it's a breach of freedom of expression. And the council said, no, it's not, again, because of the objective pursued. They had a look at the information that had been published for RT Council. In any case, I think the courts made it very difficult, based on that judgment, for individuals to challenge their sanctions listing and argue that it's an infringement on the freedom of expression. But what was, let's say, interesting in that decision is that the Court of Justice didn't take into account the fact that it was the Council of the EU that arbitrarily decided that these sanctions should be imposed on RT France. Whereas if you look at the European Court of Human Rights, and when they discuss infringements on the freedom of expression, they always check, well, is there a third, well, not always, but in their case law, they have checked whether or not a third party is involved in evaluating whether or not this information should be censored in order to, for there to be a safeguard against the arbitrary restriction imposed by the executive. So yeah, in the case of the Council of the EU, if we allow it to have the sanctioning power, it would definitely be, I think, running the risk of having an arbitrary imposition of power.
In the case of Jacques Baud, Jacques Baud is living in Belgium, in Brussels. He's a Swiss citizen.
Yeah.
Do you see any way, any option of diplomatic protection?
So I guess that would mean that the Swiss authorities would have to take up Jacques Baud's case and would have to actively seek to say, well, we find that the European Union in these measures against Jacques Baud have violated our nationals' human rights. And, we're going to advocate for the EU, for example, to lift these sanctions. So I don't know if that is the, let's say, policy or on the agenda for the Swiss authorities.
Back to the legal process. Yeah. Do you have in mind any case where a challenge of sanctions were successful?
There have been delisting. So usually there's individuals who have successfully argued before the Court of Justice to have their name or, have themselves delisted. And often that has to do with the court finds that the council didn't provide what they call a sufficiently solid factual basis. So they didn't provide enough evidence, or that there was an error of assessment. Yeah. So that does happen. So usually it's this looking at what is the listing criteria given by the council, and does it provide the information to justify that?
Do you remember specific cases, Russian oligarchs or something?
Do I remember? Well, one interesting case, I cannot remember his name. I think his first name was Nikita, and I wonder if his last name was Marzipan. No, Marzipan is. It probably was not Marzipan. But he was a Formula 1 driver, and he was sanctioned by the EU because of his association, because he's a family member of an individual who had been sanctioned, and the council found that the court found that the council had not sufficiently demonstrated that there was such a link between Nikita and his father to justify keeping him on the list. So it was, in the beginning, it was very common for the court to order the council to delist an individual because, the council wouldn't provide sufficient evidence. I think this kind of taught the council that maybe, since the court is checking the council's own criteria, the council thought, well, we just have to be a bit more vague or a bit more open with our sanctioning criteria. And that can help us, justify certain listings.
And there were cases where the court told the EU Council to delist, then they changed the text overnight and they relisted the guy.
Yeah. So one case that comes to mind has with two Russian oligarchs. I think their names were Friedman and Avin. And initially, they were sanctioned because they were said to support Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin in the war against Ukraine. And the court said, well, no, the council has produced no evidence saying that they support this activity. So then the court ordered the council to delist them. But then the council sanctioned them under the criteria of leading business people in Russia. So they're sanctioned again, but under different criteria, essentially because they're businessmen operating in Russia.
And again, arbitrary.
So again, they decide, well, okay, this didn't work, or, we can't keep them on this criteria, so we're going to change the criteria. And so then the court, I believe they're challenging their listing. I don't know if a decision has come out yet, but then the court will say, okay, is this person indeed a business person operating in Russia? And so then what would you do to no longer be on that list? You would have to sell your business, I suppose. And then the facts change, and then the council cannot keep you on the list.
In effect, is this the rule of law?
Yeah. So, again, because of the, let's say, exceptional nature of sanctions, a lot is accepted. But, yeah. And that's why, for example, one could question, if we talk about proportionality, the cost that is imposed or the restriction that is imposed on an individual to what extent do these Russian business people actually contribute to the war against Ukraine? So I'm not sure that every single business person, how wealthy they are, necessarily has ties to Russia or the Russian government, or is able to influence the decision-making process in that manner. So to the extent that you're sanctioning people who have very little influence, again, I don't know. I'm just saying like this hypothetically, then how does that justify keeping them on the list?
What would be your advice for the lawyers of targeted people?
Well, I can imagine that those who have decided to challenge their listing have hired experienced lawyers who would be aware of the EU sanctioning procedure. But and how the court has assessed these measures. But yeah, I would say to have a good understanding of how the Court of Justice usually reviews these sanctions, what has failed, and what has succeeded, and of course to try to shape the argument so that it will, let's say, go along with the court's usual reasoning with sanctions. If, of course, you would always try to argue, for example, that one of your fundamental rights has been violated, or that it's excessive or a disproportionate restriction on your human right, but then try, maybe with the knowledge that might not be successful in light of the court's previous jurisprudence. So kind of like to help the court along so that it doesn't have to break rank with its previous judgments. So that the court wants to have a consistent approach in how it reviews sanctions.
Do we need a broader social debate on the freedom of speech, on constitutional rights? What do you think?
I think for sure. I think, of course, I don't think that it's only the Court of Justice of the EU's job to safeguard our rights. I think that it's also important that there is more social and political awareness of the power that the council has, how it can be used, and the consequences that can have. And I think that we should be having a discussion about sanctions as a foreign policy tool, how they're being used, and not only just about the impact that it can have on human rights, but also the impact that it can have on, let's say, the EU's relations with third states, or, moving forward, how would it look with Russia, stuff like that. So I think that there's not so much discussion really on sanctions as a foreign policy tool, how they work, what their impact is, and whether that is something that we really want.
How do you judge the role of the European Parliament? Are these sanctions regarding the European Parliament part of helplessness or something else, of weakness?
Yeah, well, they haven't been given a role in the sanctioning process. They could I don't know exactly how the procedure works with the European Parliament, but I know that they could speak out against the Council. What's interesting, and this I think has been a trend that I noticed last 4 years, is that often members of the European Parliament are in favor of the Council adopting sanctions and advocate for more sanctions. So it was a few years ago, I was invited to speak before the European Parliament on sanctions. And when I was there, I suddenly realized that one of the reasons I had been invited is because the members of Parliament were considering adopting a resolution calling on the Council to sanction media outlets or individuals who would be involved in spreading misinformation or disinformation. And so it really struck me that it was members of the European Parliament that were calling for that, because I saw that there would be huge issues for the freedom of expression. And again, in that context, the concern was how a foreign actor like Russia would use information in order to meddle or to influence European democratic practices. And so I thought it was interesting in like the Parliament, which is supposed to represent democracy in the EU, is suddenly, using or advocating for the use of tools which would stifle democracy or the sharing of voices. So yeah. So unfortunately, the European Parliament doesn't seem to be concerned about what's going on.
And the same thing with the German parliament, the Bundestag. Yeah. The Bundestag transferred the EU sanctions into national law and was tightening those sanctions. Everybody who, for example, helps Jacques Baud can be brought to prison. How do you think about that?
It's actually it's an EU directive that has criminalized if you assist someone who is being sanctioned, or you help someone circumvent sanctions, you can be, go to jail or get a penalty. I don't know exactly what the consequences are, but
you can get 10 years in prison.
Yeah. So that's and that's something that the EU did when it started sanctioning Russia. It realized that there's all these discrepancies between European member states and how they implement the sanctions and how they respond to sanctions violators, so on and so forth. So they wanted to harmonize the procedure and adopt a baseline that all EU member states have to put in place. So now it's a criminal to assist someone who is being sanctioned.
Are these sanctions a tool to produce anticipatory obedience?
Well, I guess it's similar to the question on, whether or not these sanctions could be used to self-censor. But I think it's interesting how we would be willing to accept the fact that the Council has this power and that we may be willing to comply with it, without asking any questions. So we might think, if the Council has sanctioned someone, then it has a good reason for doing so, right? So we don't really want to think more about it. But I think that there's a lot of things, even before the sanctions, that demonstrated that individuals are more inclined to comply with authority than to, let's say, push against it or not comply.
In the American Constitution, for example, the First Amendment is very strong, the freedom of expression. In contrast, is the EU destroying the freedom of speech and the freedom of having an own opinion?
Yeah, if this goes unchecked and if we allow it, then we might slowly be eroding the exercise of that freedom. And I think even the US, even though freedom of expression is considered, to be a foundational value within the United States, they've also been adopting practices that are quite stifling towards free speech.
What do you think, as somebody who's from Canada and the Netherlands, partly with one leg in the EU and partly not in the EU, is the EU becoming a new form of despotism?
Again, another big question. But I would hope that it's not. So again, it's the whole risk of if the EU adopts these acts, and usually they tend to be very complicated legislative acts that not everybody pays attention to, and they're adopted, and then suddenly they're having impacts or effects on you without you necessarily being aware. So it's possible, again, that if we don't talk about these types of tools that are being adopted, if we don't talk about their implications, that we kind of walk into, I don't know if it would be despotism, but a society where there is a lot more restrictions in place than we would want to.
What do you think is the sanctions regime of the EU only the beginning in a process of transformation, constitutional states, the rule of law into a new form of authoritarian states?
So I think, the EU, because at times the EU law prevails over national law, it's able to have influence on national jurisdictions that, people would not necessarily have voted for. So that's one of the critiques against the EU. And again, they have this power, let's say, which I would say that they should use it responsibly with awareness. But it's also our job as citizens and as residents of the EU to be aware of what is happening. So yeah, it can only happen if we let it happen, actually.
Thank you very much. Professor Alexandra Hofer.
Professor Alexandra Hofer says that if people don't discuss or challenge the sanctions imposed by the EU, if they just accept them without legal or public debate, this could mark the shift toward a new authoritarian regime, maybe even the beginning of the end of democracy. Here on Against the Current, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide.
Die Propagandamedien verschweigen.